Uh, Good evening, everybody. I'm Sudaroli. I'm from Prajnya. I'm happy to welcome each one of you to the second edition of Prajnya Equality Colloquium series. Actually, this series has 4 lectures on all the Saturdays starting from the it's all the Fridays starting from the second Friday. It goes till the end of the month, last week of the month April. So 2 lectures will be in English and 2 lectures will be in Tamil. So the first lecture today is going to be in English, and actually we are very proud to curate this series every year and hope to. I mean, this is the second edition and hope to do this every year April, which is supposed to be the month of Dr. Ambedkar's birthday. The objective of the series is the lecture is to focus on, I mean, initiate various discussion on caste and gender. Today is the first lecture, and I'm also more privileged to welcome Nrithya Pillai today. She is the first speaker of the series. The topic is choreography of a Brahminic nation, caste and gender in the making of classical Indian art. And the lecture is going to be for 45 minutes, and 45 minutes will be the question and answer session. And I encourage all of you to enter your questions in the chat while you listening to Nrithya, so that she will be able to answer your queries at the end of the session. So I'm also more privileged to introduce her, even though you know her very well. But I want to do it very formally. I'm also very feeling proud to introduce her. Nrithya Pillai is a dancer, dance composer, singer, writer, speaker, dance instructor who proudly claims her heritage dance lineage. Following the legacy of maternal grandfather, Swami Malai Raja Rathinam Pillai, she consciously preserves and reanimates the rich repertoire and the teaching and choreographic practices of her celebrated ancestors, who include V. Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, T.K. Swami Nada Pillai, and Padmasri Valuvur D. Ramaya Pillai. Carved out her own space as a performer, which impeccable training and vast creativity. Nrithya represents a new kind of artistic and intellectual engagement with the troubled history of Bharatanatyam. She vigorously challenges the power relationships and ideologies that made the form unavailable to women of her community, and advocates fiercely for the restoration of credit for Bharatanatyam technique, repertoire, and philosophy to the hereditary community of practitioners. Nrithya's voice raised against casteism in the contemporary dance world, and is unique in the world field today. And her message against historical misrepresentation is relevant and powerful. I'm eagerly waiting to hear her powerful voice against historical misrepresentation. So over to Nrithya.
Thank you, Sudaroli, for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and good evening. I would like to thank Prajnya Equality Colloquium series for reaching out to me to have this important conversation at this juncture. I think both are crucial, the conversation and the juncture. This is the birth month of a global anti-caste icon, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And like many who fight oppression and marginalization, I take inspiration from Ambedkar's writings and political stances. We are at a crucial juncture where it is important to be questioning and critically analyzing everything that has been handed over to us: histories, beliefs, notions of culture, morality, and entertainment. All of these have been affected by the intersections of caste, gender, and privilege. And this is a reason why art forms marked as classical by the state, like Bharatanatyam, continue to be exclusivist. Only a select few who have the right kind of intersections have been able to make it. My talk will simply question the notions of what is classical, who performs it, where it is being performed, and why it is being performed the way it is being performed. The present issues of caste, class, and gender are all driven by histories of cultural nationalism that led to the reinvention and reimagination of what is today called classical Indian art. Our unquestioning acceptance of the supposed heroes and victims of this narrative have almost never, with a few scholarly exceptions, been critically examined through the lens of justice and equality. Today, I'm going to venture into the realm of issues related to caste, class, and gender in the arts, focusing on how present-day issues must be critically related to the nation's 20th century past. I want to state clearly I want to state clearly right at the outset about terms such as Devadasi that are stigma-laden, confusing, and problematic. This term conflates women from different caste locations with different lived realities under one grouping. This conflation and usage of the term happened during the social reform discourse. I would persuade people to use the term with caution and nuance, making it clear who they are referring to and the time frame that it relates to. I will use the term hereditary dancing women as opposed to Devadasi through this talk, except when the usage of the term becomes unavoidable and is referring to its usage by cultural nationalists during the reform and the reinvention processes. Since its inception, the idea of modern India has been an extension of caste society. Under the garb of cultural nationalism and the nation's progress, the historically subordinate castes continuously faced multiple forms of loss and disenfranchisement. Their performance traditions and practices became objects of appropriation, while the dominant castes gained the very opposite, namely prestige, class, and capital. For the nation-building exercise to be successful, performing arts were recast as the nation's intangible culture and heritage, pure and authentic bodily practices that dramatized Indianness, conditioned by a unique mix of ideas about Victorian morality, the deeply politicized reform of urban upper caste Hinduism, anti-colonial anxieties, and the need for a unified national culture, untainted by Western and Islamic influences. The Indian elites, who were the driving forces of nationalism, reformed and repopulated the world of performing arts. Around the country, several music and dance forms were uprooted from the bodies and minds of mostly Bahujan performing communities and grafted onto the bodies of elite, mostly Brahmin women and men, who were then proclaimed as saviors and rescuers of national art and culture. Tamil and Telugu-speaking Brahmins and Bengal's so-called Bhadralok elites were front and center here, and these individuals were perhaps among the earliest cultural nationalists of modern India. Today, in mainstream historical accounts of Indian dance and music, one often comes across celebratory narratives of Brahmin and Savarna women performing publicly as path-breaking events. This celebration is accompanied with the dismissal and often elitist ridicule of Bahujan women from hereditary performing castes. This ridicule stems from Victorian notions of morality, and the rescue of these art forms from Bahujan bodies is then heralded as a savior act, and recasting the art with dignity and modesty, which only Savarna bodies could embody. This dignified art that invariably chooses themes like Hindu nationalism, devotion, or mythology, and panders to the patriarchal Brahminic aesthetic of femininity. Themes of nationalism and anti-colonial sentiments were introduced into these forms, often in a reductionist manner as signs of virility and strength of a markedly Hindu-Indian civilization. My own great-grandfather, Padma Shri Varuvu Ramaya Pillai, who played an important role in this grafting of Bharatanatyam onto the bodies of the new elite practitioners, was one of the first Bahujan hereditary dance masters to compose dances based on songs of the Tamil nationalist poet Subramanya Bharati. These choreographies were also presented in early Tamil cinema and were then looped back onto stage performances of Bharatanatyam. In addition to the nationalist themes, forms like Bharatanatyam were also identified with projects of Hindu reform and were recast as Vedic and Shastric arts. The distinctly Bahujan roots of these art forms were intentionally erased from public memory. So much so that several generations of practitioners today falsely believe that these so-called sacred and divine art forms have Brahminic origins and that they could be traced back in antiquity. The contributions of sometimes Muslim courtesans, tawaips, to the art form of what is called Kathak, Tumri, and Ghazal, and the different courtesan castes that were the original practitioners of the corpus of court and temple dancing, identified today using several post-reinvention names such as Bharatanatyam, Odissi, Mohiniyattam, and the newly minted Vilasini Natyam, are intentionally invisibilized because today these forms are understood as national heritage in a mode created, controlled, and performed by largely upper caste women. Such women, even in the 21st century, continue to celebrate themselves and their immediate ancestors as the people who saved these arts from the morally fallen Bahujan courtesan performers. Here, I would like to delve into the caste angle with respect to Bharatanatyam and speak about what happened less than a century ago. I would like to say that it's impossible to divorce upper caste stewardship of the arts, Bharatanatyam in this case, from the larger history of Brahmins and the civic power in colonial Madras. Brahmins have wielded disproportionate amounts of power in the life of the modern city. First, under the aegis of the British government, they were read as indigenous intelligentsia of South India and placed in positions of civic power. This is a complex process that, of course, has an even older history, and the works of ethnohistorians like C.J. Fuller and Nick Dirks has explored this in detail. The linking of Brahminic civic power to the arts in Madras really happens in the early decades of the 20th century. The following is the common historical narrative about dance. Bharatanatyam is the reinvented format of Sadir. Sadir was exclusively performed by women from hereditary performing castes, referred to as Devadasis in Tamil Nadu, especially around the Tanjavur region since time immemorial. Revivalists such as Rukmini Arundale, E. Krishna Iyer, and upper caste cultural icons like K. Subramaniam, Dr. V. Raghavan, and reformists like Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy played an important role in whatever happened to Bharatanatyam. And essentially what happened is the democratization of the art form. It is proclaimed that what was essentially an inheritance of a few immoral courtesan castes was opened up to people from all castes and classes. This then lent respectability to both the art and its performers. I would like the PPT to be shown. So there are so many problems when we accept this narrative and when we accept it uncritically. First, the reinvention history cannot be separated from the politics of the present, nor for that matter can it be separated from the politics of the social reform. The reform and the reinvention were continuous processes, even though many scholars seem to want to read these as two unrelated issues. Traces of both these braided processes live in our present. I think we now need to begin to rewrite histories of the reinvention that explicitly account for caste and casteist exclusion. There is still a powerful lobby that insists that the reinvention at the hands of figures like Rukmini Arundale or E. Krishna Iyer was not at all casteist, that their visions for the future of Bharatanatyam were somehow about social equity, or as people in Chennai often say, the democratization of the arts. In popular parlance, this period unfortunately is celebrated using problematic language such as revival or renaissance, without asking the question, for whom was it a revival versus for whom was it a loss? Can we go to the next slide, please? Because we don't have a ton of time today, let us just focus a bit on E. Krishna Iyer, who once described himself as the chief architect of the Renaissance of Indian dance. So quickly, for those who don't know, Krishna Iyer was born in Tirunelveli district of Tamil Nadu and studied law. He practiced as a lawyer at the Madras High Court until 1943. Music and theatre were amateur interests of his. And in the 1930s, he joined Pammal Samandha Mudaliar's drama company, Suguna Vilasa Sabha. And in 1939, he acted in a Tamil film. Incidentally, those famous pictures of him dressed as a female dancer are not some kind of a protest he staged by dressing up as a Devadasi to prove the validity of the dance to a suspicious public, as we hear in dominant anecdotal histories. But all of these photos of him are either from dramas staged by Suguna Vilasa Sabha, in which he acted in largely female roles, or from the film Kichaka Vadam, in which he performed the role of Brahannala of Mahabharata. As the work of Professor Hari Krishnan has shown, the pieces he performed in the theatre and the Tillana he performed for the film were pieces based on the technique he learned from one of my ancestors, Madurantakam Jagadambal. Can we go to the next slide? So this slide shows you the performance that Rukmini Devi watched in 1932, which happened at the Music Academy, which made her take interest in the art form of Bharatanatyam. Incidentally, by 1935, she becomes an exponent of Bharatanatyam and starts performing. But this is the beginning of where she sees this art form. And this performance that happened at the Music Academy was, Krishna Iyer was instrumental in setting up that performance, in making sure the performance happened. Can we go to the next slide, please? So around roughly the same time that Muthulakshmi presented her abolition bill to the Madras Legislative Assembly in 1927, a group of upper caste nationalists in Madras adopted what they called a sympathetic view of the arts. In other words, while these cultural nationalists agreed with the reformers that the lifestyles of the hereditary dancing women had to be criminalized at all costs, they felt that they embodied precious music and dance practices that needed to be grafted onto respectable women's bodies. And these transformed arts were to be deployed as the heritage of the nation. To this end, the Madras Music Academy, an almost exclusively Brahmin organization, established by the Indian National Congress in 1928, began to host a series of performances by women from courtesan backgrounds. The previous slide showed you one of those performances, a picture from one of those performances. These performances, held at the very height of the Devadasi abolition movement, cannot be read as an instance of well-intentioned public patronage of hereditary female artists, as they are usually represented in dominant histories of Bharatanatyam. In a letter addressed to Muthulakshmi Reddy in the Hindu newspaper in 1932, E. Krishna Iyer, the then Secretary of Music Academy, explains, For my part, it is no question of art at the expense of morality, or even positive encouragement of the present day Nautch girls as a class, and never a justification for the perpetuation of the Devadasi class as such. The heavens would not fall and morality would in no way be jeopardized if one or two cases of very good art is reluctantly tolerated in exceptional instances without the associated vice as a matter of temporary evil necessary pending the coming up of better persons. In other words, the public display of dance of these hereditary women at the Music Academy was a temporary evil. It was meant to jumpstart a process by which upper caste elites could practice and steward the arts in the future. Years later, in 1948, in an essay titled Renaissance of Indian Dance and Its Architects, Krishna Iyer makes it clear that an intentional program of appropriation and social engineering was at work on the part of upper caste cultural nationalists through the work of the Music Academy. With all these, Bharatanatyam was still in the hands of the exponents of the old professional class, with all its possible and lurking dangers as pointed out by social reformers. The efforts of the present writer was turned towards steadily taking it out of their hands and introducing it among cultured family women of respectable classes. We must add that these terms like respectable, family women, and better persons are certainly to be read as markers of socio-economic status. But in this case, the term respectable classes is also a marker of caste. It is the antithesis of the term dancing girl class that was used in the abolition debates between 1927 and 29, a term that Krishna Iyer himself used in his letter to Muthulakshmi Reddy. In much of the nationalist discourse, as several historians have demonstrated, the English word class was a muted reference to caste. And Krishna Iyer's words make the transference of knowledge project stand out as an undeniably engineered one. And yet there are those who refuse to acknowledge the fact of appropriation, even though it is so clearly and unabashedly stated here. This is, of course, because the re-scripting of dance history was done at the very hands of individuals like Krishna Iyer himself. And subsequent generations of India's dance historians followed. Most of these later dance scholars were deeply entrenched in the project of cultural nationalism. They were connected, often politically and personally, to the government agencies such as Sangeet Natak Academy, the Ministry of Culture, and others. This situation continues to this day. Projects of dance history writing in India, therefore, for decades after the reinvention, served the nation and created a standard, uncritical, and easily reproducible narrative about reinvention. In all this, the issue of caste was intentionally rendered invisible. Not only were music and dance recast in terms of, making them Brahminic symbolic and, in the terms of Brahmin symbolic and technical language, they were also repopulated by upper caste elites. Reading that again, not only were music and dance recast in terms of Brahminic symbolic and technical language, they were also repopulated by upper caste elites. This gave rise to an entirely new cultural economy that enabled circuitous global flows of an embodied idea of Indian classical heritage. Can we go on to the next slide? This is my familial lineage of sorts. And you can see that there are many people who play a very important role in the history of Bharatanatyam, which includes Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai and Thiruvalaputtur Kalyani Ammal, and Varur Ramaya Pillai and Swamimalai Rajaratnam Pillai. I think there are many details around caste that flow through the reinvention, and these are yet to be written about. And of course, let's not forget that the same holds true with music history, or for that matter, any other art form. And we are lucky that slightly more progressive movements have been made on that front. Another related but important point has to do with the idea of aspirational Brahminism and tokenism in the arts. It would be ridiculous to assert that Brahminic stewardship implies that only the upper caste participate in these art studies. But to have one Dalit performer, two Muslim performers, three Christian performers, four non-Indian or multiracial performers, five Isai Velalar performers, etc., become the mouthpieces of aspirational Brahminism and ventriloquize the same old script of cultural nationalism will not affect real change. The kind of tokenism has been in effect since the 1940s through the rhetoric of the so-called democratization of the arts that was supposed to have been the end goal of the unity in diversity model of cultural nationalism of the mid-20th century. These token representations of diversity do not challenge the basic structures of power. The cultural spaces, the critiques, the pedagogy, the scholarly representation, institutions that are still undoubtedly Brahminic and work to keep Brahmins at their center. These token representations, in fact, reinforce these structures of power as the new custodians of an art form that would have otherwise died at the hands of colonialists who wanted to replace Indianness with Westernness. I would also like to talk about this new phenomenon, which is again a repercussion of Brahminic power that has gripped the dance world since mid-1990s. Namely that of Brahmin women dressing up as Devadasis and claiming to represent the lost Devadasi traditions and attempting to mimic these imagined women. This mimicry is often ridicule of an imagined crassness and low culture, a sort of an elitist mockery of an uncultured woman. I equate this phenomenon, which I call Devadasi dress up, to the phenomenon of blackface in the United States and several white majority Anglophone countries, where for centuries, Black people have been impersonated by non-Black bodies as a form of entertainment. The mockery of the perceived country mores of music and dance, the lack of sophistication, the Black Southern accent, and their intellect was even sought from Blacks themselves. Much like how the few surviving hereditary dancing women are expected to bring to life an imagined Southern aesthetic. This then gives control over the communities being bullied, stripping them of self-esteem and dignity, while also usurping their cultural practices of music and dance. What is interesting here is that Brahmin women claim to do Devadasi dress up to create awareness about something that has been lost, as a kind of cultural nostalgia about a bygone age of Devadasi dance and music repertoire. I think one of the problems in this power matrix is the discipleship that these Brahmin women claim under older women from the hereditary community, from whom they receive such repertoire. Thus, recognizing these Brahmin women as the true custodians of an antiquated Sadar. These women also take the liberty to assume that boastful claims of learning from surviving hereditary dancing women somehow gives them an intimacy around representing their gurus, something that they believe trumps the caste-based power that they are exercising in their relationship with such figures. Incidentally, even the older women from whom repertoire is received do not represent themselves or dress themselves in the manner that these Brahmin women do. This clearly establishes how this is about playing dress up, using the notion of cultural nostalgia and not the present day realities of hereditary dancing women. Disturbingly, these Brahmin women who want to acquire the Devadasis art in the 21st century repeat the old cycle of appropriation all over again by playing dress up. But in a world where social justice has come front and center, they try to claim that their project is one of reparation and equity and speak in a language of Brahminic neoliberalism. They do this while they use their power to delegitimize voices like mine, deciding selectively who the real subaltern voice can be. Ultimately, these projects are only about maintaining Brahminic control over representation of the discourse on Devadasis. Such acts can never enable young women from the hereditary community at any level, thus successfully attaining the objective of maintaining status quo. We must also remember that for an older generation of Isai Velalar women in rural South India, the critical discourse is not important, but patronage is. These women, like the women of the 1930s, such as Karekal Sarada, who tried to teach in Kalakshetra for a while, still see the urban dance scene as a realm of fiscal opportunity and Brahminic patronage as the key into that world. Moreover, from the standpoint of rural women, the ongoing fiscal patronage translates into other kinds of loyalties, including the public defense of such acts of appropriation if necessary. Who can blame them? After all, they have been unable to pull themselves out of the shock of financial insecurity and penury initiated by the criminalization and reform process. Therefore, caste-based patronage enables familiar economies of competitive social mobility. This is why criticality, politics, and intersectional feminism are all important. These kinds of politics are not restricted to Bharatanatyam alone. It is applicable to traditions of performing arts across India. Now I delve into the case of Kolkata. Kolkata was the home to a thriving Tawaif culture, while the names of a handful of such women such as Rasulin Bai, Begum Akhtar, and Siddheshwari Devi are remembered in the post-independence Indian art world. Most other hereditary women artists were left to live as second-class citizens, unacknowledged for their contributions in artistry. In West Bengal, where too often society is proclaimed to be casteless by caste elites, high culture took a turn that is almost never spoken of as erasure and appropriation. Rabindra Sangeet appropriated ball and so-called folk music of many communities, which are celebrated as its inspiration. Forgetting the omnipresent structures of power and inequality between the worlds inhabited by these artists and the elite world of Rabindranath Tagore and his followers. The same could also be said of the highly tenuous practice of Rabindra Nrithya, which has been almost unequivocally celebrated and its legacy of appropriation and college never questioned. In this context, where we might turn to the often slighted question of Tagore and caste. Tagore's support of Gandhi during his fast before the Pune Pact clearly establishes the connections between Savarna power structures and forms of cultural nationalism. Hindu identity, as it was reconstituted in the early 20th century, thus clearly hinged upon vote bank politics that prevented separate electorates for religious minorities and Dalits by nationalist figures such as Gandhi and Tagore, ensuring the interests of the Hindu caste society and the dominant caste was protected. We must think critically about how such casteist political interventions informed and continue to inform notions of art, culture, and history in modern India. Given this history, Savarna women in the classical arts occupy a position that is unique. Their femininity and womanhood are well crafted, celebrated, and neatly presented to us as path-breaking, revolutionary, and being up against the odds of patriarchy. All until questions of caste are raised. Savarna feminism and its comfortably caste-blind narratives have allowed a homogeneous woman entity to emerge in the classical arts. Within it, women are at once being the first woman musician or dancer to do something new. They are heralded as feminist icons. There are girl boss artists in Kalakshetra saris, smashing patriarchy and simultaneously also spewing casteist rhetoric of the artistic kind. It is most common to hear things like, but the dance had to, after all, be sanitized and made respectable, or that the art was dying and had to be saved. It is not discussed today as to how Savarna feminism in the classical arts and the mediocrity it nurtures through its reluctance to address caste and by dissociating gender from caste, stokes the development of a xenophobic Hindu nationalist discourse. Today, I would like to acknowledge that all of these celebrated art forms are vehicles for the propagation of Hindu nationalist politics. Indeed, so-called classical dance in particular is explicitly and continually put to the service of Hindutva with its display of spectacular storytelling about Hindu gods and goddesses. Can we go to the next slide, please? These again are pictures from my family, just to show you how we lived during the 40s, 1940s, when the whole reform and reinvention was actively happening. The picture on the left is Vaithiswaran Koil Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, who was one of the first choreographers in Tamil cinema who moved from Vaithiswaran Koil. The dancers, Yogam and Mangalam, are one of the first Brahmin women to perform, to learn from hereditary dance teachers. The next in line is a picture of Varu Ramya Pillai, and along with him is sitting, along with him on the extreme right is my maternal grandfather. Down under in the center is T.K. Swaminatha Pillai with Varu Ramya Pillai and his three other sisters. You can see that these families are very closely connected, and the woman that you can see in the individual picture of the woman is Madurantakam Jagadambal, who I refer to as the teacher of E. Krishna Iyer, the woman he learned his technique of Bharatanatyam from. Can we go to the next slide, please? These again are pictures. If you remember the dance performance at the Music Academy in 1932 by the Kalyani daughters. This is Tiruvalaputhur Kalyani, who again is related to me, whose son is T.K. Swaminatha Pillai. And if you had seen the family tree, you know that all of these people are from a very closely knit set of families. Can we go to the next slide, please? So these are the slides that I wanted to show you guys, but I'm going to end with how we need to be critical. I want to start again from, how we need to acknowledge that all of these celebrated art forms are vehicles for the propagation of Hindu nationalist politics today. The so-called classical dance in particular is explicitly and continually put to the service of Hindutva with its display of spectacular storytelling about Hindu gods and goddesses. A far cry from the dance's original Bahujan roots and aesthetic vocabulary. But it is not enough to critique only the Hindutva recasting of these forms. We must think back to what appropriative and casteist processes enabled linkages between art and radical nationalism. In simply celebrating figures like Rukmini Arundale and Tagore, for example, without thinking critically about how dance for them was also a symbol of nationalist heritage, we are missing a big part of the story of how these arts came to be modes of majoritarian politics today. Thank you. I can open up the questions now. I can open up for the questions now. Student ma'am, you are on mute.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. So you winded up on a correct time actually. So yeah, we open up for the question. Can you, the audience can ask questions. You can directly ask, or you can type on the chat. Okay, so before that, I will maybe I can open up with a question like, what do you think? Like, what are the challenges like the women having now? I mean, when we compare, like you were discussing of the um, uh, like intertwining threads of caste and how the women like including in the art, so it is more complex threads, right? So what are the challenges like the women have in the classical art, in performing as classical art with respect to gender and caste?
Like I said, it is a space that is dominated by upper caste women. I mean, it is only a certain powerful circuit of people who can exist in these spaces, and that is certainly a problem where when historically, I should say that access was denied to members from families like mine. Therefore, the beginning of the art form itself is rooted in injustice, because if they're opening the art to everyone, how can you deny access to the original practitioners? So the art form stands on the cultural violence of denial of entrance to the hereditary practitioners. Today, we have very few practitioners who are from hereditary families, but who refuse to speak the politics of what has happened, obviously because of fear of being, being not accepted in these spaces. But most practitioners of the art form today are upper caste Savarna practitioners who happen to celebrate this problematic history, and that in itself, I think, is the core of the problem with the art form today for any woman to enter into the art form. If you have the right kind of intersections of caste and class, it will be possible for you to dance. But if you don't, then there are some cases where a non-Brahmin might have the right class background to enter the dance field. But again, it's a question that we must think about, whether she will be accepted the same way that the Brahmin dancer is accepted. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Nithya. So somebody has asked a question. So could you please one moment. AD, I don't know the name, but somebody AD commented, thank you for this wonderful talk. More power to you. Could you please talk a bit about the way classical dance and music has been shown in theater and cinema, where or Bahujans are part of this process, or where or they projects of Brahminical appropriation too?
I think anything to do with the arts, there has been a transference that has happened that includes cinema and theater. The first actresses of Tamil cinema, incidentally, are women from hereditary families. But they have only served as a standby again. Before, it has, we don't remember these women. We don't celebrate these women. And they somehow only had a marginal existence, even when they were part of cinema. When Savarna women and Brahmin women became actresses, there was a certain kind of celebration of them, a certain kind of respectability that was given to them. But it was not the case for women who came from these courtesan backgrounds. They had a complex relationship with with their public personas. So if you read the book by Professor Hari Krishnan, which talks about cinema, early cinema, and the actresses, and how dance choreography was done by predominantly hereditary dance teachers. Most of the male dance teachers from hereditary families were also the first choreographers of dance in early cinema. The aspects of the idea is that, you cannot separate anything from processes that have happened around, all aspects of art. It could be cinema, it could be theater, it could be the same cultural nationalism that I say drove Bharatanatyam history, also drove cinema. Like I mentioned here clearly how I'm sure people remember Aduome Pallu Paduome, that is danced by Kamala Lakshman, who is one of those celebrated dancers, who's celebrated as in many anecdotal historical references. She's celebrated as the first or one of the first Brahmin women to be dancing Bharatanatyam, and how she inspired a lot of women to learn Bharatanatyam, who learned from my great-grandfather. But you can see that, she was also one of those first Brahmin women to be dancing Bharatanatyam on cinema. And this kind of cultural nationalism pervaded across the arts. It was all pervasive, is what I want to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Nrithya. You have another question. Two more questions. One more. Shakti asked, thanks for your brilliant talk. From the perspective of who constitutes the audience, the internet has been framed in recent years as a potential equalizing space for viewing or listening to Savarna-dominated classical art forms, which have generally been exclusionary in this regard. How far do you think this is true?
In a way, where's the money in dancing on the internet? That's my question here. Where's the money? What are we building? We might be able to build a certain kind of cultural capital, or we might be able to get some sort of acknowledgement of our presence. But I feel that all spaces that have the potential of being monetarily beneficial are taken up by the Savarnas, taken up by the dancers who have the right intersections of caste and class and gender. So while I'm happy to see that the internet has opened up a space where a lot of dancers dance from their kitchens, from their bedrooms, from their halls, from the roads, I am not sure if it serves a bigger purpose where they are remunerated for their performance, where art becomes a livelihood. Art as a livelihood is still a big question, because how it was, the idea of the reimagination of these art forms by figures like Rukmini Devi comes from notions of it being a spiritual pursuit, of it being something beyond money, something that you sacrifice yourself for. These are the notions that were brought along with notions of reinvention. So art being a livelihood becomes a big question, and that continues because of the problematic history and the unacknowledgement of that problematic history. Art being a livelihood is still a problem today, and anybody who does not have the means to just dance without worries about putting food on their table can dance, but what about those who need to make a livelihood from the arts? That's the question. Yeah.
Okay, so you have, I think, few more questions.
Shall I read it out? The
Yeah,
next
you can.
question is
Yes, and
from Sirisha Naidu. She says,
okay.
thanks so much for your talk and for speaking the truth. Challenging the circuit cannot be easy. 2 questions. Do you think the art form can be used to challenge Hindutva and Brahminical practices? What vision do you have for the art form in promoting a more just society? So to answer that question, I think my mere existence questions these narratives, because, you know, the existence of a person from a Bahujan caste whose family plays a very important role in these erased histories, which in these histories which they really want to erase, that they really want to invisibilize. So actually, I think is a threat to these kind of narratives. And sometimes I feel that my mere existence questions all these notions that they want to propagate, that the mainstream Bharatanatyam world wants to propagate. So I think in its original form, when hereditary practitioners were performing these art forms, the core essence was about love, about human love. So I feel that sexuality and eroticism and a claiming of that sexuality and claiming of a space to exhibit that kind of themes based on love and eroticism can actually be something that is a counterpoint to the kind of Bharatanatyam that is performed today. And I simply dance pieces from repertoire that has been passed down in my family. So in my family or families like mine. So that way, then you know, I also speak about the history when I dance. So I feel that while I'm doing this, while I'm dancing and speaking, I take my politics along, and I also take the politics of being a modern progressive woman of the 21st century who is questioning all kinds of injustice. So I feel that this way, when the art form is danced by somebody who knows their politics, then you know, it will definitely be a practice that challenges Hindutva and Brahminical practices. My vision, I think, is to have more people who question these narratives that are these mainstream narratives that are you know, passed in Bharatanatyam world, in the Bharatanatyam world. So I've been teaching a lot of people, and when I teach, I also talk about the problematic history, about appropriation, about the politics of the present day form, how today dancing about Rama and Krishna can only be problematic today in a time where there is so much Islamophobia, there is so much of casteist oppression. So where today there is a lot of problems, it's only going to be more problematic to be speaking of Hindu majoritarian themes. So I think that's something that I would actively talk about, to not do mythological themes, to not propagate these notions of Rama and Ramarajya and Krishna and these kind of Hindu themes. Yeah.
You have another question by Janani Ramesh. What would you say are some of the largest knowledge gaps pertaining pertaining to class and caste in the classical art form?
I think there is no caste awareness. There is just, I mean, there has been, as I've spoken in my talk, I think there's been intentional erasure around caste in the classical world, in the world of the classical arts. I, in fact, feel that the term classical itself is, whenever I write classical, I write it as CLASS in capitals, because I think it's classist. It's these notions of what is classical and what is folk stems from so much of classist exclusion that, you know, I think these notions are in itself casteist, and that knowledge is lacking today. Any practitioner of a classical art form, their identity is based on these very problematic narratives, and questioning the history, questioning those very power structures that created them would probably erase their identities, would make them question their own identities, and none of them want to do it. None of the practitioners of Bharatanatyam want to question the problematic history of Bharatanatyam, because then they would know that their identity of being a Bharatanatyam dancer is based on cultural violence. That, I think, would be the knowledge gaps that I would be wanting to state. Yeah. What would you advise an upper caste or upper class or generally more privileged student of Bharatanatyam so that they might not be further propagators of the same violence that they have a historical background of? I mean, I certainly would say that, you know, to one important thing is to not take up space in speaking or in dancing these histories, is what I would say, by which I mean that dressing up as a Devadasi or dressing up as a hereditary dancer or claiming to be them or becoming the subaltern voice is certainly problematic. And I see a lot of people doing that in a manner, saying that they are only creating awareness or they want to talk about histories. And when they are talking about these histories, the language that they use are again very problematic, considering the fact that they are from the oppressor caste. So I think it's important to speak of Brahminism in your households rather than the victimization of women from the hereditary community. Talk about how you benefited from Brahminical appropriation of Bharatanatyam, how your families played a part in the appropriation. But to not speak about that, but to dress up as a hereditary dancer is very problematic. I also think that we need to have a very critical shift in how we dance Bharatanatyam today. If anyone who's a practitioner of Bharatanatyam is also a person who is aligned with progressive politics, they need to rethink how they are dancing Bharatanatyam, why they are dancing Bharatanatyam. For me, it's been a process. I think I said this in a recent talk, which is that any Bharatanatyam is mimesis of a Bahujan courtesan performer of the past. So every time we dance, every time we wear those jewels, every time we dress up to dance, every time we wear the salangai, we are actually doing a mimetic representation of this woman from the past who has been criminalized, who has been excluded. So anyone who dances this form, that includes me, is actually doing mimesis. And for me, I think the reparation for this kind of injustice comes from working on your repertoire, thinking about the themes that you are performing to, making sure that you know, you do not support majoritarianism in any way while you're dancing this. Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions anybody wants to ask? Another question.
Can you tell us more about how you share these thoughts with your students? So I actually have a student here. I can ask her to speak if she is willing to speak. If Rituparna can say a few words. I mean, she learned from a different style. She learned from a different school of dance, and then she came to me, and I can ask her to talk about you know, how I teach. I mean, I think that I mostly speak about what we eat, what we do at home, what we it's a place where we do not restrict talking about certain things which are usually restricted in Brahminic Bharatanatyam spaces. So I make it clear that I am a Bahujan. I make other Bahujans feel comfortable within the spaces of my dance class. We talk about what they do in their families. It's a space where we open up about our politics, and I have lost many students because of this. Of course, upper caste, Savarna dancers whose parents have found this problematic and you know, have stopped classes with me. But I also feel that there are many who have stayed on to learn from me. Ritu, would you want to be answering that? Are you around?
Hi. Yeah, I would love to answer that. So I came to Akka. I actually am from Kolkata, and I have learned the dance for a long time. And while I have loved the dance form in my body, I have always had problem dancing this kind of Ramayana theme, Krishna theme. I mean, and also I find problematic the history that is preached around the dance. And then I came to Kalakshetra, and that was like another level of oppression. And all this while, I found that I felt that I cannot express myself fully. Like there was this injunction that my body has to be a certain way to be the Bharatanatyam dancer, the kind of beauty, the aesthetic that the Brahminic Bharatanatyam preaches. And when I joined Akka, and it was I'm still working through whatever has been taught to me through all these years. Like it's a continuous process of erasing that Brahminical aesthetic from my body. I mean, which I was fighting against all this while, but I also kind of admitted inside myself to be accepted. Like I also sought acceptance as a dancer. And also the history, like while I learned a piece from Akka, we are talking about the history of injustice in the choreography. For example, when I did a Jatiswaram, a particular piece from Akka, and I learned it how Akka has learned it in her family. And the same choreography is taught in Kalakshetra. It's like almost phrase by phrase, you can see the similarity, and it is said in Kalakshetra, Rukmini Devi's choreography. there is no mention of hereditary contribution. And this is not the only piece. Since then, we have found out many pieces taught there, which are just proclaimed as Rukmini Devi's choreography. So this is the way we, and then there are pieces which were originally Shringara pieces, and how bhakti has been brought into the interpretation in the choreography. So yeah, so this is like a few of the example how we talk of the casteism that the dance history is like entrenched in.
Thank you, Ritu.
Thank you.
I think there's one more question.
There is one question, yes.
Could you please comment on the differences between Brahminical and Bahujan style? To non-specialists, the Brahminical style seems more angular and devotional and less sensuous. So I really don't want to talk about this delineation of Brahminical style and Bahujan style, because I feel that, again, that's problematic to delineate like that. For me, the idea is to, I say this over and over again, the fact that for me, Bharatanatyam comes through this history of, my ancestors have been part of the reinvention too. So I cannot claim to be doing something from 100 years ago, because I don't know how 100 years ago Madurantakam Jagadambal danced. But Madurantakam Jagadambal was the one who taught Baru Ramya Pillai, and Baru Ramya Pillai was the one who taught Swami Malai Rajatna Pillai. And I dance because dance came through that legacy. But in all of this, I cannot deny that the politics around Bharatanatyam and the social conditioning that happened to Bharatanatyam did not affect my dance. It did. It affected dance within hereditary families. So therefore, there was a shift in the aesthetic of performance, even within hereditary families. But what is important is that women in the family had been distanced from the dance by the 1940s and the 50s. My grandmother was a figure of Brahminic domesticity. She did not dance. Her life was about supporting my grandfather's career. I think after several years, after some decades, somebody like my mother could learn a little bit of dance because she merely existed in those spaces where my grandfather was teaching most of his predominantly Brahmin students. And even for figures like my mother, marriage was insisted upon as seeking respectability, as a measure to seek respectability. And I remember this very clearly, that my grandmother would say that my tata, my Swami Malai Rajatna Pillai, said something about how if my mother's husband, my father, accepted, if she gets married and if the husband accepts, then she can teach dance. But performance was a complete no-no for us. And a few decades later, when I came into the picture again, I think the entrance into that world was slightly bigger, slightly wider. But again, this notion of performance is very hard on Bahujan women and on women from these castes. So there is no Brahminic aesthetic and Bahujan aesthetic, but for me, it's about an aesthetic that is inclusive of that history. That is inclusive, that does not, wash away itself from that history. So I think I actively try to, and often I think a lot of my grandfather's disciples critique my dance by saying that this is not what your grandfather taught, or this is not how your grandfather, this is not authentic, this is not the legitimate version of what your grandfather taught. And that's the point that I want to insist upon, that I am trying to create an aesthetic that is befitting of my Bahujan body of the size of my body size, of my bodily aesthetics, that and it's going to be definitely impossible to not bring your own bodily aesthetics when you dance. And when a Bahujan dances, it is going to come through. So this is a intentional way that I am trying to create an aesthetic that is befitting to my body, my mind, and how I feel at the moment, with all of this history burdening me. And similarly, I feel that each of us, each practitioner of this art form has to think about deproblematizing the art form for themselves. And for some of you, it can be about going and learning from a hereditary person. For some of you, it could be about working on yourself. For some of you, it could be about like disengaging from Bharatanatyam itself. But I think it's an individual process, and we need to find our ways to dance this very arduous art form.
So anybody wants to ask any question? The last question. Yes, I think so. Yeah, so everybody ask question, and thank you for being with us, Nrithya. It's a wonderful presentation, and also the explanation to the questions asked also.